morning. Thanks for tuning in. A few weeks ago, I preached a sermon, a message that talked about Jesus being the alternative king, heaven's alternative for the world. And today's message is kind of a continuation of that idea, and we're going to keep looking at that topic. What it means to have Jesus as our alternative king, and then also what it means to be people in his alternative kingdom. When you think of Christianity, whether you think of it as a set of beliefs or a lifestyle that is lived, when you think about Christianity, what comes to mind? What do you think of? Do you think about Christianity as an alternative lifestyle? I know that that's a saying that has, certain connotations. When we think about an alternative lifestyle, you might think about a motorcycle gang. You might think about hippies or nomads. You might think about, bums or vagabonds. You might think about people who live off grid, or people who live in secluded communities such as monks or the Amish or the Mennonites. But what about Christians? Do we fit into that category of a group of people who live an alternative lifestyle? I don't think we usually put ourselves into that category, but based on the definition, we might need to rethink that. The definition for an alternative lifestyle is a lifestyle that is perceived to be outside of the cultural norm. So an alternative lifestyle is a lifestyle that is perceived to be outside of the cultural norm. And so obviously we put people like hippies and motorcycle clubs, people who live off grid. We don't think of them as being normal or living a normal life in society. But maybe we shouldn't think about Christians in that way either. The reality is that if Jesus is heaven's alternative for the world, then what Jesus calls his followers into is an alternative lifestyle. In the world, but not of the world. Living in the culture, but not reflecting the same values and morals of the culture. And so Jesus calls us into something that is radically different than what is around us. Something that is truly outside of the cultural norm. And so what we're going to do today is take a look at Jesus' Sermon on the Mount. And so if you want to turn to Matthew chapter 5, you can go ahead and turn there. In the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus teaches a set of teachings that are a departure from the status quo. And Jesus will take the Torah, the law of Moses, and he will make a departure from the Jewish law. He will give it greater meaning. He will shed some light on what it really means to fulfill the law, to live it out. And so you'll notice in the passages that follow the passage that we're going to read, which is the Beatitudes, Jesus will say to the people listening to him, "You have heard it said in the Jewish law," what had become to them, the cultural norm, the status quo. Jesus says, "You have heard it said, but I say." And so Jesus fleshes that out. He shows them what it really means to live as God's people. And so what we'll study in the following weeks is a radically different way of seeing the world and seeing ourselves. So Matthew chapter 5, verses 1 through 10, and I'm just going to read the Beatitudes. I'm not going to read the introductory verses, but you can. And I'm going to be reading these from the New English Bible, which is kind of an obscure translation. You probably won't find it on your Bible app, but I really like the way that this translation sheds some light on the text. And so it says here, "How blessed are those who know their need of God. The kingdom of heaven is theirs. How blessed are the sorrowful, for they shall find consolation. How blessed are those of a gentle spirit, for they have the earth for their possession. How blessed are those who hunger and thirst to see right prevail, for they will be satisfied. How blessed are those who show mercy, for mercy shall be shown to them. How blessed are those whose hearts are pure, for they shall see God. How blessed are the peacemakers, God shall call them sons. How blessed are those who have suffered persecution for the cause of right. The kingdom of heaven is theirs." You probably noticed that the New English Bible translation sounds a lot different than the translations that we're used to when we read the Beatitudes. We have become extremely familiar with the Beatitudes. Blessed are the poor in spirit. Blessed are those who mourn. Blessed are the meek. We've become so familiar with that passage that maybe those words don't seem so radical to us. But remember, Jesus is talking to first century Jews, and he is painting a lifestyle that is in stark contrast to what the Jews of his day were accustomed to. Just pay attention to the language that Jesus uses here. It is eternally relevant, and it is eternally radical. When Jesus says, "How blessed are you when you are poor, when you are sorrowful, when you are gentle, when you are merciful, when you are persecuted," that doesn't make a lot of sense, culturally speaking. In society, you don't want to be poor or sorrowful or gentle. You don't want to be merciful or persecuted. Those are all things that have a negative connotation, and yet Jesus is telling us, as he was telling them, in the kingdom of God, that's how you want to be. That's how you want to see yourself, and that's how you want to see your place in the world. What Jesus is saying is extremely radical. And I just want us to cover that first blessing here that Jesus shares with his followers. He says, "How blessed are those who know their need of God. The kingdom of heaven is theirs." Jesus' first radical teaching is, do you know that you need God? Do you know that you need God? That's often translated as "blessed are the poor in spirit." What does it mean to be poor in spirit? And I think the answer is the way that the New English Bible translates it. What does it mean to be poor in spirit? It means to know that you need God. It means that you realize just how much you depend on God. And you here doesn't just mean you as a physical person, a physical being that needs food and water to survive. It's not just a recognition that, okay, we need God to put food on the table and to give us our daily bread. It's not just that, mentally we need the idea of God, of a divine being, to inspire us and to spark our intellect. It's not just that we need God as an idea, we need God in the depths of who we are. You is a reference to your soul, which is why in other translations it says, blessed are the poor in spirit. Blessed are those who know that they need God, not just physically, not just mentally, but in the wholeness of their being. They realize that they depend on God. That's what the you here is talking about. How blessed are those who know their need of God. And so the idea then is like a poor person who owns nothing and therefore needs everything. We have nothing and we depend on God and we need God in our lives. We need Him deeply. And so Jesus is teaching His followers not to be self-reliant, but to depend on God. He teaches us that, we don't bring anything to the table. We have a God-shaped hole in our hearts and in our lives that cannot be filled by anything else. We can seek to fill it with things like money or entertainment, things like work or a family, but we will always be dissatisfied until we put God in His rightful place in our lives, until we recognize how much we truly need Him. And so, regardless of how good we are, or how skilled we are, or how self-sufficient we think we might be, Jesus encourages us to see ourselves as needing God. We might be the most self-sufficient person, the most self-made person. We might have amazing intellect. We might have spectacular skills in some certain area. But if we don't know that we need God, then we're nothing. And we have nothing. And it's important to recognize that mindset and that heart set and that worldview is in stark contrast with what the world would have us believe, and especially with what culture wants us to believe. The world has moved further in the direction of believing that we are the center of the universe. Centuries ago, it was believed that God, a creator God, and a divine being, was at the center of the universe as creator, as Father, as God. But increasingly, society and culture and mankind has moved in the direction of believing that we are at the center of the universe. And what that means is that we don't need God to fulfill our physical needs. We don't need God, as an idea, and we certainly don't need God to govern our hearts and our lives and guide our footsteps. And so humans have begun to think and believe that we don't need God. But Jesus says quite the contrary. We do need God. And you can't be poor in spirit if you are rich in ego and pride and think that you are at the center of the universe. Therefore, you don't need God to direct your steps or to guide your life or govern your heart. One of my favorite stories that I think really illustrates our need for God, that really illustrates what it means to be poor in spirit, is one where Jesus' disciples are fishing. Peter and the other apostles, the other disciples, they're on the Sea of Galilee and they are fishing. You can find the story in Luke chapter 5, verses 1 through 11. And supposedly, Peter and some of the other disciples, James and John, supposedly they were expert fishermen. Like, they were professionals. That was what they did for a living. And so they knew what they were doing. Supposedly they were great fishermen, but they spent one night and all night on the Sea of Galilee trying to fish, and they come back weary with empty nets. And so it's been a complete and total failure on their part to be successful at fishing, even though that was supposedly, what they were good at. And so it says in Luke chapter 5, verse 4, Jesus says, "When he finished speaking, he said to Simon Peter, 'Put out into deep water and let down the nets for a catch.'" So Jesus tells them, go back out and put down your nets so that you can catch some fish. And Peter replies, "Master, we've worked hard all night and we haven't caught anything. But because you say so, I will let down the nets." And when they had done so, they caught such a large number of fish that their nets began to break. And so they begin to haul in a tremendous amount of fish. And in verse 7 it says, they signaled their partners in the other boat to come and help them. And they came and filled both boats so full that they began to sink. And when Simon Peter saw this, he fell at Jesus' knees and said, "Go away from me, Lord. I am a sinful man." Isn't it interesting that Peter's response to this event isn't, "Wow, I'm a crappy fisherman. I'm not very good at fishing, am I?" No, Peter's response to this event is, "I'm a sinful man. I am a broken person. I'm really messed up." He realizes that his need isn't just to be able to pull a bunch of fish out of the lake. His need is of God. And he is a broken person. He is a sinful man, and he desperately needs God. But Jesus' response to Peter, recognizing his need of God, recognizing his brokenness, is in verse 10, "Don't be afraid. From now on you will fish for people." Don't be afraid. And so Jesus is telling Peter, as he tells us, don't be afraid to embrace your brokenness. Don't be afraid to recognize your sinfulness. Don't be afraid to embrace your need. It takes a brave person, a courageous person, to come to the place where they recognize that I can't be at the center of the universe. Because if I'm at the center of the universe, everything is chaos. Everything is out of control. I simply can't get it together. And as hard as I try, something always goes wrong. There are things that are out of my control. Jesus says, don't be afraid to recognize that. Don't be afraid to embrace your brokenness. It takes a brave person to recognize their need of God. Even though the world would have us think that we're weak because we need God. Or that we're not self-sufficient because we need God. Jesus says it's okay to embrace that. Because before Jesus can put us back together, we have to see ourselves as broken. Before God can heal us, we have to see ourselves as wounded and hurt. Before we can be changed and molded and transformed, we have to recognize that something's not right. Something needs to change. Something needs to happen in our lives. And doesn't life end up teaching us that anyways? Even if we do think that we're the center of the universe? Even if we do think that we're capable enough to handle what life has to throw at us on our own? I didn't know that I needed a new car until mine broke down. I didn't know that we needed a new roof until ours began to leak. I didn't know that I needed God until I saw my own helplessness. And so it says here that Peter fell at Jesus' knees. he gets down onto his knees and says, Lord, get away from me. I'm a sinful man. He fell at Jesus' knees. And going back to Matthew chapter 5, that's exactly the posture that Jesus is describing to his disciples. That's what it looks like to be poor in spirit. That's what it looks like to recognize your need of God, is to fall on your knees before Jesus. To know our need of God is to be on our knees before Christ, begging for help. That's the connotation of the words that are used in Matthew chapter 5. But according to Jesus, on your knees is not a bad place to be. On your knees is not a bad position to be in. Because the amazing thing is, from that place, you can only go up. From that place, Jesus lifts us up. Remember what he tells Peter. Don't be afraid. Do not be afraid. Don't be afraid to be on your knees. Don't be afraid to recognize your brokenness. Don't be afraid to embrace your need of God. Sure, Jesus comes alongside of us as we live our lives and we try to make things work. He sees the burdens that we carry. Sometimes he points out our sinfulness. He points out our brokenness. The things that Jesus says sometimes can wound us, but he wounds us in order to heal us. He breaks us in order to put us back together. Jesus, like any loving friend, points out the areas in our lives that reflect our brokenness. But then he points to his Father and he says, let me introduce you to someone who can help. Blessed are those who know their need of God. Because once you recognize that you need God, Jesus will introduce you to him. And that need is fulfilled. And so Jesus offers a loving hand to pull us up off of our knees, to introduce us to God. Because our greatest need isn't money, it isn't a relationship, it's not a spouse. Our greatest need isn't a safe country to live in or a big bank account. Our greatest need isn't a decent education. Our greatest need is God. And if we know that, then suddenly God's kingdom becomes ours. How blessed are those who know their need of God, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. As soon as you realize how much you need God, you become an owner of the kingdom of heaven. You become a recipient of the most important thing in the world, the rule and reign of God in your life. And so Jesus teaches us the most important lesson, that if you have God, you have everything. And that's a radical truth that shapes our hearts and shapes our lives. And so let's seek to live that out. Let's seek to live out that reality every single day. That truth that we need God. And that because we need him so much, he allows us to be a part of the kingdom of heaven. Blessings.